Lucy. Thank you so much for being here today. We're so grateful that we get to interview you. I would love if you could introduce yourself.
Well, thank you for having me as your guest, Courtney. I'm excited to have this opportunity. I am a Canadian writer. I write primarily historical fiction, and I'm talking to you today about my fourth book, which is called The Brickworks, and it will be released in October. And it's a historical fiction that covers the period 1879 to 1910, and it's all about the costs and the benefits of industrialization. So there's a little bit of bricks and a little bit of local history, quite a bit about industrialization, and some romance, just to keep it interesting.
Love that. I would love if you could tell us what some of your other books are about as well.
Um, Certainly, thank you. So the first book I published was called The Marzipan Fruit Basket, and it was published by a feminist press in Canada called Inanna. And it's a collection of short stories, most of which had already been published. They were all about women and a sense of dislocation. So the different phases in a woman's life that she goes through, whether she's an immigrant, whether she's a new widow, whether she's an escaping an abusive relationship, there's a period of dislocation. It's very much a part of women's lives and their social history. And so each one of those stories focused on an aspect of dislocation for women. So that was my first book. The second book was Eleanor Courtown, and it was a historical fiction based on a true story of a poisoning, actually, here in Canada. And it's from the 1870 period, and it had to do with a privileged young Irish woman coming here to look for her cousin and being poisoned so that they could steal her wealth. So it's a really interesting book, a lot of local history. One of the characters in the book is a medical doctor. He saves Eleanor from her poisoning. But I spent a lot of time studying medical practices, the period. So that's a really interesting book from that perspective. The next one was Stella's Carpet, and it's a story of intergenerational trauma. So it's also historical in that it has a dual timeline. And that book captures a lot of my father's stories from the Second World War in Europe and deals with intergenerational trauma, how the trauma of those events continues to filter down and impact subsequent generations. So the Brickworks is a return to historical fiction, and I'm just really excited to share it with people.
Love that. What inspired you to write your book?
The Brickworks. Well, it was interesting. We'd gone for a drive and then a small hike in the country. And in the distance, I saw what I thought was an old woolen mill. And so we hiked close by and discovered it was the ruins of an old brickworks called the Cheltenham Brickworks. And I'd never seen it before, and it was quite romantic looking. And my husband picked up a shard of brick and passed it to me. And I saw that the brick was studded with straw. It was really old and it was very coarse texture. Anyway, we didn't think much more of it. I stuck the brick in my pocket and put it on my writing room desk. And that brick spoke to me. I thought, I don't know anything about brick making, but there were a lot of fires at the turn of the century. Um, in Toronto, there were huge fires in the what was 1880s, and it had wiped out much of the Toronto downtown core. And we live in a small town, small lakeside town. In 1883, same thing happened here. And what I realized was that when people were rebuilding parts of Toronto and also small places like the one in which we live, they needed bricks. They decided not to build again in clapboard, but they were building in brick. And so all these little tiny brickworks were springing up all over the country as I began to do research. And I didn't know how people knew how to make bricks. Where did that technology come from? Where did that knowledge, that skill come from? And I became really interested in sort of the process of brick making, but also the transference of that kind of knowledge that came to this country, and learned that a lot of Scottish immigrants brought that technology with them and were really important in terms of sharing that technology and establishing all these little brickworks all over the country. So we went to Scotland. I did research. I discovered there was a brick making museum in Saskatchewan. It's a National Historic Site. And so I flew to Saskatchewan and learned all about the technology there. And the more research I did, the more invested I became and thought there was a real story there. And then suddenly the characters walked into my head and the novel began.
I love that. That's so amazing. When writing your book, who were you thinking of when it comes to who your book is for?
Interesting. Um, I wasn't really, to be honest, I wasn't really thinking of the audience. I was thinking of the characters and just really responding to the story that I felt needed to be told. Um, when I finished the book, and I took me 6 years, and I've done 15 edits of the manuscript. I think by the time I was finished the book, I thought that it would really appeal to women because there's the romance, but mostly to people who were curious, people who were interested in history and local history, people who were interested in technology and in the impacts of industrialization on small communities. And I'm hoping that it really does appeal to a broad reading audience. It's not just a romance. There's a lot of technical information. I've had it vetted by an archaeologist who specializes in bricks and the history of brick making, but also vetted by a civil engineer because there's quite a bit about bridges in the book. And so all of those processes are documented. I mean, we talk about all sorts of technical kinds of pieces that are a part of the history of communities. And I think that's really going to appeal to people. I hope it will.
I love that. That's super unique. How long have you been writing and what made you really sit down and start?
Well, I've been writing all my life. Um, I wrote my first novel when I was in grade two. And I had a wonderful teacher, Miss Lee. And she really encouraged me and thought I had something special. And so I was the only child that she asked to read their novel to the class. And I was quite shy as a young person. But I was happy to share my novel. It was called The Great Mumbo. It was a detective novel, um, inspired, I think, by Nancy Drew. Anyway, when I was reading this to my classmates, even though I was self conscious and shy, they started laughing and clapping and congratulating me. And I was just hooked. And so I haven't stopped. I mean, I have been writing since a very, very young age.
Love that. What is your schedule like when you are writing a book?
Um, I am retired. I no longer work full time. So I have the luxury of time to spend a lot of time on my writing life. But having said that, writing isn't always about writing. There's quite a bit of research involved, quite a bit of traveling around, taking reference photos, finding out information, interviewing people. And then there's the actual writing process, and then the editing process. And editing takes a lot longer than writing for me. Um, but my preferred writing time is really late at night and into the early morning when the house is quiet and the neighborhood is quiet. So it's kind of a witching hour. I would say from about 11 o'clock to 3 o'clock in the morning. That's my favorite time for writing first draft. But editing, I can do anytime and have to, because so much editing is always involved.
What do you need in your writing space to help you stay focused?
My writing space is a very rich little environment. It's got lots of bookcases and lots of
The
books.
book.
My favorite books, but also reference volumes. I use a lot of reference books when I'm writing and researching. My computer. I also have some really lovely artwork. My husband's a painter, and so one of the paintings is called Nebula, Birth of a Star, and it's full of explosions of color, which I love. And another painting is a seascape, which I find really soothing. And I have lots of, I suppose you'd call them little tchotchkes, little things that I've picked up that feel like story. And a lot of them are antiques. So old brass keys, for instance, I have a whole collection of those. Um, Porcelain creamers and very, very fine china. Um, just a number of artifacts. And then, of course, all of the highlighters and colored pens and whiteout and staplers and all of that stuff that we need as we're working on manuscripts. But most of my little things, a lot of reference photographs. I take a lot of photos and I use those when I'm writing as reference, sometimes to describe a character's face, sometimes to describe an outfit that they're wearing. And so I surround myself with those. I also have a whiteboard, if you will, that's a story planner. And I plot out my chapters and the plot points on my whiteboard with little post-it notes so I know where I'm going when I'm writing first draft. And I also have a lot of flip chart paper, which I post up all around the room. And each character gets a place on the flip chart paper. And I use that to reference their speech. So if my characters, like in the Brickworks, some of my characters come from Ireland, some of them come from Scotland, and I jot that down on the flip chart paper with anything that's idiosyncratic about their language, any colloquial expressions that they use, so that I can reference that consistently while I'm doing my writing. So by the time I'm immersed in a manuscript, the room, as you can imagine, is just covered in flip chart paper and story planners and reference photos.
That's amazing. What is your favorite writing snack or drink?
Hmm. Um, well, I drink a lot of water, which is sounds pretty boring. Um, but I would love milky coffee. So I would say milky coffee and digestive biscuits. That's a very satisfying snack for me. But I try not to take a lot of time out for snacking when I'm writing, especially first draft, because once I get in the zone, I like to stay there.
Love that. What type of books do you personally enjoy reading?
I read widely. Um, so I read a lot of nonfiction, particularly when I'm doing research. Um, a book that I just finished reading that was nonfiction is by Peter Brooks called Seduced by Story, and it's the uses and abuses of narrative and how public figures and the media now reference storytelling as opposed to reporting on objective facts when they're sharing information. So I read a lot of nonfiction. I read a lot of small press Canadian release books. I like to support the independent presses, but I love historical fiction. I'll read anything that's historical fiction. And my secret pleasure are thrillers. I love something like Sherry Lapina is like candy to me. And I'll just devour a thriller in one night um, because I'm just so interested in this story and so diverted. So, historical fiction, small independent presses, thrillers, and nonfiction. I read about 6 to 10 books a month. I think it's really important for writers to read good writing. And I feel that it really helps me develop whatever skills I have.
Love that. Are there any books or authors that inspired you to become a writer?
My graduate degree was in 19th century British fiction. And I, at the time, was focused on Charles Dickens. And I love his characterizations, but he has a tremendous sense of humor. But what I love most about his work is the ways in which he exposes the social history of the time. And he does that so beautifully and so effortlessly. So that's a huge influence for me in my life. And like Dickens, I would say Elizabeth Gaskell, also a 19th century British writer, um, and also, a real emphasis on social history of the time. Her book North and South, I think, is just masterful. So those books are really important to me. I also love George Eliot, the Bronte sisters, and Jane Austen. And I think Jane Austen, for her novel of manners, the ways in which she documents the everyday life of people in the period, I think is fascinating. And so I would say, though, those were probably the most important to me in terms of formative influences. But in terms of contemporary writers, there are just so many. There's an Irish writer, William Trevor, who I absolutely adore, and Canadian writers, Margaret Lawrence, Anne Diamond, Jane Urquhart, Susan Swan. Just there's so many. It's so many books, so many writers. It's hard to keep up with everything.
Love it. What books did you grow up reading? Did you have an all-time favorite?
I loved Nancy Drew when I was very young, and proceeded from Nancy Drew to fall in love with, I think her name was Phyllis Whitney, and she used to write sort of historical romances for young adults, and I loved those. But I graduated very quickly. I went to an open school, and the elementary school that I went to didn't believe in a set curriculum for students. So they allowed students to go wherever they wanted in the building and do whatever they wanted. So I spent most of my time in the library as a very young person and began reading Thomas Hardy and Charles Dickens when I was about 9 years old, and started working my way through sort of all of Hardy's books and all of Dickens' books before I was an adolescent. And then, of course, have continued to read and reread them. And the more you read them, the more you find in them, and the more you appreciate them. But as a young person, I fell in love with British fiction at a very young age.
Amazing. On the other side of that, now as an adult, what are your favorite series or authors that if they come out with something, you automatically grab it?
Oh, so many. Sherry Lapina for thrillers, Tracy Chevalier, I would say, for historical fiction, Bianca Murray for her women's books, um, Marissa Stapley. You can call them beach reads, if you will, but upmarket women's fiction. I love her stuff. Um, who else? Rachel McMillan writes fabulous historical fiction. I love her work. Um, oh, so many, so many.
Love that. What would you tell someone just starting out with reading again?
What would I tell them about what?
What would you tell them if they were just starting out with reading again? Like they're older, adult age, they're just starting to pick up books again. What advice would you have for them?
Well, gosh, it would depend upon their interests, to tell you the truth. I mean, there are thousands of books published every week. So I try to
Try.
narrow down things that they were curious about that aligned um, with their own story, if you will. Um, I think it's hard to say without knowing something about the individual. Uh, Short stories, I suppose. If I didn't know anything about the reader and they hadn't done a lot of reading previously and couldn't tell me what they really enjoyed, I think I'd start them off with short story collections. And there are so many wonderful short story collections available right now. So I'd expose them to different types of writing by exposing them to short story collections. I think that's probably where I'd start.
Love that. On the other side of that, what would you tell someone just starting to write their own book?
I would tell them to read and to read widely so that they could understand what good writing looked like. I think that's really important. Um, I would also tell them to connect with a group of strong, supportive people, also writers, so that you had a network or a small community to bounce things off of and who could help you be objective about the work that you're involved in and support you as you're developing your skills. Um, I would also tell them to carve time out for things that really matter. Quite often, when I've spoken with people who want to write a novel, they say, well, I have to wait until I retire. I have to wait until my kids are grown. And I don't think that's true. I mean, my first novel, Eleanor Courtown, I wrote over a 10-year period. I, at the time, was working as a high school vice principal. I didn't have a lot of time, but I needed to write. It was a compulsion for me. And so I just stole time in little tiny chunks wherever I could. So 20 minutes at night before I went to bed, or several hours on a weekend morning. I'd run to the library to do research in between other errands. I think that it's important that if you have a story to tell and you feel really compelled to write it, that you take what time you have available to you and you chunk your project and you enjoy the process for as long as it takes, but you don't put it off. I think it's really important, um, that you seize that time and that desire to share a story. So read, network, chunk your time. Um, and the other thing I would say is that editing is really important, and to respect the editing process is to respect your reading audience. And again, I do teach writing workshops, and one of the things that I found is that some of the people that produce something believe that after first draft, they should get a literary agent and a book deal and a movie contract. And, there may be some people for whom that works, but not many. Most of the people I know spend a lot of time fine tuning their manuscripts and editing them and polishing them. And then, spend a longer time again trying to find a publisher or a place to place it. And I think the time that you invest in editing a manuscript is a way of respecting your potential readers and making sure that you're sharing the very best story that you possibly can prepare for them.
I love that. That's so amazing. What's one thing that people are generally surprised to find out about you?
I think that I was a career educator for 30 years, and people who knew me in that sphere were quite shocked to discover that I'd published short stories and that I'd published novels, because they'd seen me in a particular context and they'd seen me be fairly successful and very committed to the work that I was doing there. So the idea that there was this other aspect to my life was very shocking to a number of them. Similarly, people that I have met in my writing life who discover that I had a career as an educational administrator are blown away by the fact that I was so involved in that world and so committed to the work that I was doing there, because it seems to them to be so disparate from the work that I do as a writer. And in fact, I think that my work as a career educator feeds my writing, because I met so many interesting people and had so many rich, life changing experiences. And all of those things give me something to say. They contribute to my understanding of humanity and how the world works. And I think inform my writing.
Amazing. Is there anything else you would like to say or add?
No, I just would like to thank you for this opportunity, Courtney, and I hope you have a chance to read the Brickworks. I'm very excited to share it with people, and I really hope that if you do get a chance, you'll really enjoy it.
Amazing. Where's the best place for readers to find your books? I know some readers love signed copies. Is that an option and the best place they can connect with you?
Um, well, Amazon will have my books. Chapters Indigo will have my books. And here in Canada, um, the Blue Heron Bookstore in Uxbridge is where I'm holding my book launch. So they all have signed copies, and then there are a number of other places in Canada that are small little bookstores that have my books. But people can contact me through social media. I have a website, so they can contact me through my website or through social media if they're having difficulty my website does show people um, a map of places where the book is available. So hopefully, if they're interested, um, I'm also placing copies in local libraries. So there will be book club sets here locally in our libraries. But just have them reach out to me through my website if they're having trouble.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for being on. We're so grateful we got to interview you. We'll be sure to drop those links in the show notes. And again, thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much, Courtney. I really appreciate your interest.